The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the lush green fairways of the exclusive country club. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and the soft murmurs of well-dressed golfers filled the space. This was a place of power, of wealth, a sanctuary for the privileged. And today, it was about to become the stage for an unexpected turn of events. Henry Whitmore, a self-made millionaire with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, leaned back in his leather chair at the clubhouse, sipping a glass of expensive scotch. He was the kind of man who enjoyed being in control, always the smartest in the room. Or at least, that's what he believed. Success had made him arrogant, untouchable, and at times, cruel in his amusement. When he spoke, people listened, either out of admiration or fear. Across from him sat a group of his wealthy friends, men just like him, confident, powerful, and accustomed to a world where money ruled everything. They laughed easily, swapping stories of business deals and vacations on private islands. But today, Henry had something else on his mind. He smirked, tapping his fingers against the glass, and glanced toward the far side of the room, where a woman was busy wiping down tables. Margaret Johnson was a housekeeper at the country club, a woman who had spent years working quietly in the background. She was in her late 40s, her hands worn from years of labor, but her eyes still held a spark that life hadn't managed to dim. She moved with quiet dignity, never expecting anything from the people she served, only a paycheck at the end of the week. The rich men barely noticed her, except when their drinks needed refilling. Henry, however, had noticed her for a different reason. He had overheard something, a conversation she'd had with one of the younger staff members, where she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had played golf once, years ago, before life had gotten in the way. The idea had stuck in his mind, twisting into something else, a joke, a game. He turned back to his friends with a sly grin. "Gentlemen," he said, raising his glass, "I've got something entertaining planned for today." They leaned in, intrigued. Henry always had a flair for mischief, and when he had that particular glint in his eye, it usually meant someone was about to be the butt of a joke. "I'm inviting our dear housekeeper, Margaret, to join us for a round of golf." He paused for effect, waiting for their expressions to shift. Some of them chuckled. Others raised an eyebrow. "You're joking," one of them said. "Oh, I'm dead serious," Henry replied. "She said she's played before. I figured we'd see just how well she holds up on a real course. A little entertainment for us, wouldn't you say?" The men exchanged amused glances, understanding exactly what Henry was getting at. This wasn't about giving Margaret an opportunity. This was about laughing at her, about watching her fumble on the course, while they pretended to be magnanimous. With a satisfied smirk, Henry waved her over. Margaret hesitated for a moment before setting down her cloth and making her way toward the table. She stood with quiet composure, her hands folded in front of her apron. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked politely. Henry feigned warmth, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Margaret, how would you like to join us for a round of golf today? I heard you used to play." A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, caution, maybe even curiosity. She glanced around the table, sensing the hidden meaning behind their smiles. But instead of backing away, she did something that no one expected. She smiled. "I'd love to," she said simply. Henry's smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. He hadn't expected her to accept so easily. His friends chuckled, already anticipating the show. "Perfect," he said, finishing his drink. "We'll start in 30 minutes. As Margaret walked away to prepare, Henry leaned back with a smug expression. This was going to be fun, but what Henry didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret Johnson wasn't just any housekeeper, and by the end of the day, the laughter would die in their throats. Margaret stepped into the small employee locker room, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of the wooden bench as she sat down. She could still hear the laughter from the clubhouse echoing in her ears, but she didn't let it bother her. She had been around men like Henry Whitmore long enough to recognize when she was being set up as the punchline to their joke. She had seen their type, powerful men who thought kindness was weakness and that their wealth gave them the right to look down on others. She untied her apron and folded it neatly, placing it in her locker. Her fingers hovered over an old faded photograph, taped to the inside of the door. It was a picture of her younger self, standing on a golf course with a club in her hand, her father beside her, smiling with pride. Those were different days. Before life had taken her down a different path. Before responsibilities had forced her to trade fairways for long hours scrubbing floors. She closed the locker and took a deep breath. If Henry and his friends expected her to stumble and embarrass herself, they were in for a surprise. Because what they didn't know was that Margaret wasn't just someone who had played golf before. She had been a rising star, a junior champion, with a talent that had once turned heads. Out on the course, Henry and his friends waited, their clubs resting against their expensive golf bags. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the pristine green. Henry spotted Margaret walking toward them, now dressed in a simple polo shirt and slacks, her hair neatly pulled back. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that he hadn't expected. "Well, well," Henry said, clapping his hands together. "You clean up nicely, Margaret." His friends chuckled, but she simply smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said, evenly. "Shall we begin?" Henry handed her a club, still fully expecting the game to go as he had planned. He led the group to the first tee, where the course stretched out before them in long rolling hills. He stepped up first, taking his stance with practiced ease. With a powerful swing, he sent the ball soaring down the fairway, landing it near the center. His friends clapped in approval, and he turned with a smirk. "Let's see what you've got, Margaret," he said, stepping back. Margaret stepped up to the tee, rolling her shoulders, feeling the weight of the club in her hands. It had been years since she had played, but the muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of work and sacrifice. She took a deep breath, lined up her shot, and swung. The crack of the club hitting the ball was sharp, clean. The ball soared through the air with effortless precision, landing farther than Henry's, right in the perfect spot. A hush fell over the group. Henry's smirk faded slightly. One of his friends coughed, shifting uncomfortably. "Beginners. Luck," one of them muttered. But as the game continued, it became clear that luck had nothing to do with it. Margaret played with a level of skill and grace that none of them had anticipated. Her movements were smooth, her shots precise. Every putt, every swing was deliberate, practiced, far beyond anything they had expected from a mere housekeeper. Henry's amusement slowly turned into frustration. He gripped his club tighter, his shots growing sloppier, as he tried harder to outplay her. But Margaret remained calm, unbothered by his growing tension. She played not for their approval, not to prove anything, but simply because she loved the game. As they reached the 9th hole, Henry's patience had thinned to nothing. He wiped the sweat from his brow, glaring at Margaret, who stood ahead, already prepared for her next shot. His friends were quieter now, no longer laughing at his little game. Instead, their eyes held something else. Respect. Margaret lined up her shot, the final stroke that would determine the game. The air was thick with unspoken tension. She could feel Henry's eyes on her, filled with frustration, and something deeper. Disbelief. She took her time, steadying her hands, and then, with one smooth motion, she made the shot. The ball rolled perfectly across the green, dropping into the hole without hesitation. A perfect finish, a perfect game. Silence. And then, something unexpected happened. One of Henry's friends, the same man who had chuckled at her before, let out a low whistle and clapped. Then another. Before long, the rest joined in, nodding in admiration. Henry, however, remained frozen, his jaw tight. He had invited Margaret here as a joke, expecting to humiliate her, but instead, she had outplayed him on his own turf. And now, everyone could see it. Henry's hands clenched around his golf club, his knuckles turning white. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than the humid afternoon air. He had planned for this to be a joke, a way to amuse himself and his friends at Margaret's expense. But now, standing there on the green, he was the one who had been made a fool. Margaret, on the other hand, remained composed. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply picked up her ball, dusted off her hands, and looked at Henry with the same calm expression she had carried all day. She had nothing to prove to him. The game had spoken for itself. One of Henry's friends finally broke the silence, laughing lightly. "Well, I don't think any of us saw that coming," he admitted. He turned to Margaret, nodding with genuine respect. "That was impressive." Another man clapped her on the back. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Margaret smiled, shrugging. "A long time ago. My father taught me. He believed golf wasn't just a sport. It was about patience, strategy, and respect." She looked at Henry then, her voice gentle but firm. "He used to say that a real player doesn't need to look down on others to feel like they've won." Henry's jaw tightened at her words, but he said nothing. He knew deep down that she was right, and the way his friends now looked at Margaret, not as a housekeeper, but as an equal, only made it worse. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt small, not because of money, not because of power, but because he had underestimated someone, and in doing so, he had lost more than just a game. He had lost control of the narrative he had set. Margaret looked around at the men, offering a polite smile. "Thank you for the game," she said simply. Then without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving the group standing in stunned silence. As she made her way back toward the clubhouse, she didn't look back. She had nothing to regret, nothing to explain. She had shown them who she was, not with words, but with action, and that was enough. Behind her, Henry exhaled slowly, staring at the ground. His friends had already started murmuring amongst themselves, their admiration for Margaret clear. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, the sting of being outmatched. But as he watched her disappear into the distance, something shifted inside him. Maybe this was the lesson he had needed. Maybe, for once, he wasn't the smartest person in the room, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay.